Didn't you like it when they all said, we do, or I do? At that? Cute. Who's had a good morning so far?
Yes, I have.
Who slept in?
Yes.
I had one of those mornings today, and actually I'm still having it right now with this thing. I had one of those mornings where I was very well prepared, except I'd missed 3 slides off my keynote, and I only realised that just as I was walking out the door of home, and so I had to sit back down and put the 3 slides in, and I did that for you. Because I know how stressed out some of you become when the slides aren't perfect, all right? So this morning my slides are pretty well, as long as Dave up the back there doesn't mess with them, we'll be good. Won't we, Dave? We are we're not in the middle yet. This series could actually go for quite some time. Last year we had a series that went for 18 weeks. This year we've started a new series all around some of the things that Jesus said. Now, if you've read any part of the Gospels, you'll realise that at times Jesus says things that are a little bit confronting. Sometimes when we read them, we go, oh, this doesn't match up with the picture that I have of Jesus in my head. And if you're not careful, you can end up overlooking some fairly significant parts of the New Testament because of how uncomfortable they make you in the context of our current culture. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this particular series was have a look at some of the difficult things that Jesus said and take away some of the fear that you might have that Jesus said something that just does not line up with what you think God should say. Take away that fear and help you to realise and understand exactly what Jesus was getting at. One of the things that I love about God is that he never ever gets stressed by good questions that we ask him. Problem is though, we don't always ask him questions. We just look at something, we have a situation that comes up, and then we make an interpretation about God's intention through the screen of whatever it is that's happening to us, or the screen of what we are reading, and we then don't go seeking a more coherent answer from God. And I've found in my life, and I'm sure many of you have as well, that when you come to God with an open heart and say, God, I just don't really get this. Can you help me with it? He will either give you an explanation that satisfies your heart and soul, or he will satisfy you without an explanation. He won't just leave you hanging. So I want to encourage everybody, as we go through this particular series, as I've already mentioned a few times already, don't be afraid. Don't get freaked out. Jesus has an answer, and there's a reason behind everything that he said. And it is our privilege as his followers to search out the meaning of what it is that he was getting at. And this week, we are kicking off this morning with Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. This one's a bit of a doozy, isn't it? Wow. I mean, you read that straight away and you're thinking, are we reading the Bible or are we reading something else? Because it seems to be going against the second of the 2 great commandments, to love our neighbour as ourselves. How can we hate our family when in another part of the gospel Jesus said that we're to love not just our neighbour but our enemies as well? And Jesus himself was scathing of those who said it was okay to withhold money from your family if you're going to donate it for religious purposes. He said it was a violation of the commandment to honour one's father and mother in Mark 7:9-13. Then he said, you skillfully sidestep, he's talking to the Pharisees here, you skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you the law from God, honour your father and mother, and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of father or mother must be put to death. Hang on a minute, Jesus, you've just said that we're to hate. But you say it is all right for people to say to their parents, sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give to God what I would have given to you. In this way you let them disregard their needy parents. And so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition. And this is only one example among many others. Now, before we put this particular passage in the too hard basket, or completely lose it altogether, let's zoom right out and take our view of context to a whole nother level. There's an ancient literary convention that we find in some of the literature around the time of the biblical writers, where the author would juxtapose two extremes to make a point. For example, in Genesis 29 it states that Jacob hated Leah but loved Rachel. Now it's apparent from even a cursory reading of Genesis that that wasn't the case. But it's also apparent that Rachel was loved more than Leah. Now the word hate here doesn't mean to have a strong emotional dislike for someone or something. Rather, it is used in a comparative sense, meaning to love less than. Now Jesus is not commanding us, in this passage in Luke, to hate our family members, but rather to love him more than anything or anyone else. And it appears that Luke was really keen to get this distinction across to his readers, which is why he used this literary device. His listeners would have been familiar with it, so their reaction to Jesus' words wouldn't have been as extreme as yours and mine are when we first read this translation of the text in our modern day context. Now you could accuse me of drawing a long bow there. But this isn't the only place in the gospel where this particular statement of Jesus is recorded. And in Matthew chapter 10, we read it in a slightly more acceptable form for someone living in 2023. Matthew records it like this, Jesus speaking once again. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Now, I think we can all agree that Matthew's version is better than Luke's when given our current modern day understanding of conversational conventions. But his statement is still extremely challenging, but definitely more agreeable than Luke's version when taken at face value. Now, speaking of context, this statement of Jesus comes right at the end of a dialogue he's been having with his disciples around some very difficult times up ahead. Jesus doesn't pull any punches, and he lets his disciples know that the events that are about to take place won't be easy, and in the future they'll find themselves in all sorts of strife with those around them. He's warning them that persecution will come even from their own families. And if he isn't their first love, then they run the risk of losing everything, especially if push comes to shove and they choose to take the side of those who are anti-Christ in order to keep the peace and ensure their own safety. Now the question I asked myself when reading this chapter in Matthew was, why did Jesus feel it was necessary to clearly spell out what it would be like before his disciples experienced it? Jesus was very aware of the human heart. He knew how we think about things. In John 2, 24 and 25, reading from the Amplified version of the Bible, it says this: "But Jesus, for his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and understood the superficiality and fickleness of human nature. And he did not need anyone to testify concerning man and human nature, for he himself knew what was in man, in their hearts, in the very core of their being." Jesus knew people. So he knew that they needed to know what was coming down the line. Now you need to remember that Jesus knew also that he was only going to be with his disciples for a short period of time. And whilst he was around, it was easy for them to get caught up in the excitement that surrounded Jesus wherever he went. I mean, he was healing the sick, casting out demons, feeding thousands and walking on water. Everywhere they went, crowds flocked to hear Jesus. And his disciples were part of that. But there was coming a time when he'd no longer be with them, and they'd be left to tell a deeply religious nation that they had just crucified the very Messiah their own prophets have been speaking about for thousands of years. That was not going to go down well at all. And history bore that out. for the early church. Now, with that in mind, we can kind of understand why we find Jesus throughout the Gospels constantly spelling things out as clearly as he can, so his disciples aren't left wondering what he means. And quite often we see him preparing his disciples for trouble, heartache, difficult times and persecution. Why? Because he wanted them to be prepared and not get taken out of the game when hard times came. As the old army adage goes, train hard, fight easy. Or, as a saying that you'll hear around fitness settings quite often nowadays, is it's better to endure the pain of discipline now than the pain of regret later. Funnily enough, even though Jesus spelt out what was up ahead, quite often they were still blindsided by it when it happened. So how do we bring all of this into our day-to-day life? How should this statement of Jesus impact on us today? Now obviously, we don't have a foreign government, army invading our country and threatening to put to death everyone who says they're a follower of Jesus unless they abandon the faith. To be honest, if that was the case, if it was that black and white, it would probably make things easier for Jesus' followers, not harder. Some of you might remember this story. 35 years ago, whilst I was sitting in a Bible college class listening to a missionary talking about how amazing the Chinese underground church was, he went on and he said that they were flourishing even in the midst of incredible persecution, whilst the Western church couldn't even pray regularly. He banged on about the opportunities that the West had that the Chinese church could only dream about. And I was just sitting there listening to him. I'm thinking, I was getting a little bit agitated. At the end of it, I went up to him and I said to him, I asked him, I said, is it easier to be a Christian in China or in the West? And he said quite emphatically, definitely in China, it's easier. And the reason being was that the line between being a believer or a non-believer was so incredibly sharp, you couldn't miss it. Whereas here in the West, it was blurred and difficult to see, making it far easier for us to go off track over time and end up shipwrecking our faith. And that was 35 years ago. It's a lot worse in the West today than it ever was when I was just starting out. So the line is a lot more blurred. In fact, nowadays, they will point the finger at Christians and say, you are cruel, bigoted, unkind people. You don't love others because of the stance that you take on certain issues. And for Christians who have been taught, hopefully, well, that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength, and the second is just as important, to love your neighbour as yourself. When we get that type of kickback from the media, not from the people we know, by the way, just let's be realistic here, the people that I know in our local community, and I know quite a lot of them, would all say that I love them, that I care about them, that I'm a nice bloke. None of them would say that I'm a bigot or a terrible person, unless they had an axe to grind against the church as a whole. But when it comes to the way people interact with us normally, it's usually, well, it should be very, very positive. But the media puts out this narrative against the church that makes things really difficult for us at times, because it blurs the line between what is right and wrong, what is morally right. And remember this, just remember this, when God gives us morals, when God gives us rules to follow, when he gives us laws, it's always for the flourishing of the humanity. It's not that God just one day pedantically came up with this list of things that we should do or shouldn't do. He gives us his direction so that we will live our very best life. And that doesn't mean all the time it's pleasant. That doesn't mean all the time that we might necessarily agree with it. It's a little bit like when you're a kid and your parents are saying you need to go to bed at a certain hour, and you'll go, no, I don't want to, I want to stay up later. And then later on as a parent you realise that the reason that the parent said that was for their own sanity. Just needed a bit of space from those little darlings and send them off to bed nice and early. But sometimes you don't agree with it. But it's always for our own good. Jesus said, the Son of Man, he He had come that we might have life and life in all its fullness.
Yeah.
Now, the early church was birthed into a world that was quite antagonistic toward their faith in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And it got way worse before it got better. After the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity in the early 4th century, which marked the beginning of the Christianization of the Roman Empire. But going back to the context of Matthew, we have Jesus making a very provocative statement right before he challenges the allegiance of his followers. In verse 34 to 36, he says this, "Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth. I came to bring a sword. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against a mother, and a daughter-in-law against a mother-in-law. Your enemies will be right in your own household." That was just before the other statement, right? So Jesus was on a roll on this particular day, right? He's throwing out statements that just hit people between the eyes. Now, a little bit of an aside though, it's only the first statement on the first sentence on there that Jesus actually, that was an original Jesus statement, because the second part of that was actually, Jesus was directly quoting from an Old Testament prophet, the prophet Micah. Now, the bit that I'm most interested in is his first statement, because it leads into the prophecy from Micah, where he said, "Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword." Now, once again, we have Jesus saying something that seems to fly in the face of his commandment to love others, and also flies in the face of his identity as the Prince of Peace. However, it's actually not that complicated. We have no record of Jesus or his followers, except for Peter, taking up a sword in their resistance against their persecutors. So we can safely say that Jesus wasn't talking here about an actual physical sword. So what was this sword that he was talking about that would cause so much grief? Hebrews 4:12 gives us an insight into what Jesus meant when the writer says, "For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." Jesus' words are meant to expose areas in our lives that we need to deal with. As you deal with areas in your life that his words are bringing to the surface, you will find that some of the relationships you had previously will become strained. Why? Because you're no longer engaging in behaviour that's contrary to what's best for you and others. And some people will take that badly. People, in general, want you to be like them. Have you noticed that? They try to get you to go along with what they're doing. I mean, I experienced this when I became a Christian. I was in the army at the time, and I was a typical AJ, which means amazing. It means army jerk. But that's what AJ stands for. It's terrible. It's terrible. You can't say it anymore, right? So, but I was in the army, and when I got saved, it was a really interesting time for me, because initially it was like this line had gotten drawn in the sand, and I realised that if I was going to be a Christian, then I either had to be full on or not on at all. This idea of being a submarine Christian, disappearing during the week and then only popping up on Sundays, I thought, well, that just doesn't fly from my understanding of Jesus and God. If God is God, then he has to be God 7 days of the week, not just 1 day of the week. And so some of the behaviours that I'd been involved in up until then, I thought, well, I really can't do this anymore. And I'd grown up, many of you know my story, I grew up in an alcoholic family, and around that time I made a decision that I was no longer going to drink. Every Friday and Saturday night we would go, if we're in the barracks, we would go out to town and we would get plastered. That was the way we did things. And then when I became a Christian, and I'm not saying that having alcohol is a sin. Getting drunk is, but having a drink isn't. But there's some interesting research that's just come out recently about how bad alcohol actually is for you. So, but anyway, but for me, I decided that I was no longer going to drink at this point in time. Not because I was a Christian, not because people were saying you shouldn't drink, but just simply because I knew what it was like when I was a kid growing up in our family, and I didn't want to support that industry anymore. That was my personal position on it, and yet the Bible, I mean, so my mates, they were still going out on Friday night and Saturday night. They wanted me to come along with them. And I'd read the Bible, and the Bible says, you've got to love people. And I thought, man, I can't say no to them. I've got to go out with them. Have you ever drunk 10 glasses of orange juice? No. Mate. And the problem was, I was going out to drink with them. I'm only drinking orange juice. They were drinking alcohol. Alcohol's a lot more expensive, and we were all shouting, right? So you'd go around these drinks. So it was quite an expensive trip, going out and helping them all get drunk, while I was drinking orange juice. But it was a really interesting time, because there were certain things that I stopped doing that my mates expected me to continue to do, and there was a little bit of pushback. We were over in Malaysia for an exercise. We were over there for 3 months, and it was my birthday, my 21st birthday. My 21st birthday in Malaysia, and two of my mates said, look, Dermot, we know you don't drink, but it's your birthday, it's your 21st birthday. Come on, come down to the boozer and we'll just buy you 2 stubbies. Just 2 stubbies. I'm thinking, oh, okay, I'm not going to be sitting, I can't get drunk on 2 stubbies. I go down there to the boozer. Their stubbies were 1.5 litres each. I got through 1.5, then jumped up and ran out. So that's it. But there's pressure. There's pressure that will come on us when we commit our hearts to Jesus, because we'll start to act differently. And people don't necessarily like that. And you can cop a bit of flack. And all I can encourage you to do, if you're copping a bit of flack from family members, you're copping a bit of flack from friends, just keep on being true to yourself. Just keep on loving them the way Jesus has told you to love them. And what you will find, if they're not complete heroes, what you'll find is that it will eventually get to a point where they respect you. And they will go, you know what? My mate's a Christian. He's one of those ones that are right out there, but he's a good bloke. Because the interesting thing about Jesus was, he was considered a friend to all the people that the Pharisees considered far away from God. So it's not a case of you having to say goodbye to all your friends when you become a Christian, although that may be the case. But it is a case of staying true to what you believe. And if you do that, you will cop some flack. You will cop some pushback. But that's perfectly okay. Jesus is saying here that his words would draw a line in the sand that could even separate family members, and we won't be surprised when that happens. Now, I'd just like to point out something before I just move on to my conclusion, which I think is very important here. While separation of family relationships may happen, because sometimes it does. Sometimes family just push you to the side because of your faith. That's fine. Let it never be due to an attitude of judgment on your behalf. As much as you can, work toward reconciliation, even if restoration of that relationship isn't possible. You keep the door open. Don't slam it shut. Don't treat them the way they're treating you. The apostles, the disciples came to Jesus and said, Jesus, how many times must I forgive my brother? 7 times? He was thinking he was doing pretty well. And Jesus said, no, 7 times 70. It's like, okay, well, we're not going to ask Jesus that question anymore. That's a lot of forgiving that has to go on. Yeah. And Jesus is making the point, listen, you've been forgiven for every single sin you've ever committed and will ever commit. The least you can do is continue to offer forgiveness to those around you. Even if your relationship will never be fully restored, that's okay. And there are some relationships that this side of eternity aren't going to get fixed up. Whilst that's sad, it's part of the course, it's not your fault, but what you need to do is just keep an open heart as much as you possibly can. Now back to my China story. China 30 years ago made following Jesus very, very, it was a serious challenge to your own personal safety. If you chose Jesus, you could be imprisoned. In the West, for as long as I've been alive, that's never been the case. What we're faced with in the West is a gradual erosion of our first love, where we keep choosing other things ahead of Jesus. When was the last time you put Jesus in front of something legitimate that you wanted? Because we're not talking necessarily about something bad here. I'm talking about something as simple as spending an extra 10 minutes in bed in the morning because you were up late the night before, rather than getting up at your normal time and spending the first few minutes of your day putting Jesus front and centre. Now you might say, and rightly so, how's that going to change where you end up in eternity? But the issue isn't when you have a once off. The issue is when we make a habit of putting our own wants ahead of Jesus to the point where we don't even realise we're doing it. Now, none of the things on the screen behind me in themselves are really all that important in the context of your whole life. But if you continue in them, if you continue putting them before Jesus without questioning, the consequence can be just as severe as choosing to deny Jesus in a communist country. The key point here, though, is questioning. If you no longer question your decisions, if your commitment to Jesus doesn't challenge your behaviour at times, you could very well be in trouble. How do you know when we've reached that cut-off point? Well, the truth is, you probably won't. You'll just gradually drift away from Jesus until you've convinced yourself that there's no point in following him anymore. And it can happen to anyone. I'm sure most of us here would probably know someone who was once sold out for Jesus, who then gradually drifted away, and who today has well and truly put everything else in front of him in their lives. We still love them, we still care for them, but they're just not interested in Jesus anymore. What did Jesus say about people who did that? He said they weren't worthy of him. That's a bit blunt, isn't it? It's a bit hard. But that's what Jesus said. If you do that, you're not worthy of me. When you fall off the wagon, you don't just need people to tell you that you'll be okay. You need emergency intervention. You need a strong, loving response. You need whatever it takes to get you back on that wagon. And to be honest, sometimes for some people, they need almost a near-death experience before we can gain, or God can gain, their attention. It's no wonder that so many people who come to Jesus as adults do so in the middle of a personal crisis. Why? Because they get us asking all the right questions. And also, time and time again, they point out that we don't have any of the right answers, and we need a higher power to deliver us if we're to get through what we're facing. Here in the West, we've endeavoured to sanitise the experience of life as much as possible and shelter ourselves from the world around us, especially here in Tasmania. I jokingly say all the time that Tassie is the safest place to live on the earth. Because let's be realistic, even if there was a world war, we hold very, very little strategic importance in the scheme of things. They're probably not going to attack us. They're not going to send any bombs down here. They'll just send a plane down. Somebody will hop off the plane and say, hey, we own you now. Okay, that's good. Right, and they'll hop back on the plane and go back. I mean, I don't see Tasmania. I mean, if you want to live in a safe place, Tasmania has got to be probably one of the safest places on the planet to live. We have no idea what is happening in the world around us, really. I mean, there are some serious, life-threatening things happening on our planet every single day of the year, and yet here in Tasmania, it's kind of like business as usual. It doesn't impact us in any way, shape or form. But what if you're experiencing a personal crisis in your relationship with Jesus right at the moment and don't even realise it? If you're drifting in your faith, that's a crisis that's far more deadly to your future than anything else you might experience here on earth. Whether that's financial difficulties, relational issues, health concerns, even war, torture or death. It's more serious. Drifting away from Jesus is more serious than any of those things that I mentioned, because none of those impact your eternity in the same way your allegiance to Jesus does. Now, for those of you who might be thinking I'm getting a little bit carried away this morning, let me share with you something that happened to me just last week. Friday morning, a week ago, I was lying in bed jotting down some notes for this message around about 3 a.m. because that's what, no, wasn't that early, but I was lying in bed before getting up, just jotting down some notes about this message. And I was right at the point in my message thinking about my conclusion when I did what I do every single morning. I opened up my Bible app to see what the reading was for that particular day. Now, if anybody has a Bible app and they get a reading that pops up on their Bible app every day, you'll know that it could come from anywhere in the Bible. You have no idea where it's coming from. So I'm at my conclusion of this message. I open up my Bible app, and this is what I read, because I was kind of like, Jesus, is this? I really want to get across to people how important this is. It's not one of those messages that you just listen to, then go away and forget about it. It's one of those messages that you really need to personalise for yourself, internalise. And this is what I read that morning. Luke 9, 23 to 25. Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross daily and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but are yourself lost or destroyed? It was like God was standing there in front of me saying, Dermot, this is really important. This is really important. Don't let people brush over it. Where are you this morning with regards to Jesus? When we say Jesus is Lord, is he truly Lord? Or is he just simply an add-on to your life? In closing, and I said that already, but this is in closing, I want to leave you with a thought that some of you might be ready to receive, but some of you won't. Keeping the analogy in your mind of Jesus' words being like a sword, the words of Jesus will only cut us when there's something to cut. And their job is to remove from our lives anything that might take us out of the game and move us away from our Creator. This is not God being tough. This isn't Jesus being harsh. This is God being loving and compassionate, because as long as his words can cause you a bit of discomfort, you still have the option to choose an alternative path, which means you're still living under the grace of God, and there's hope.